become his masterpiece, a body armor prototype capable of stopping .50 caliber rounds. At 38, Alexander had built an empire from nothing, transforming from a brilliant MIT engineering graduate into the founder of Kramer Defense Technologies, a company that supplied cutting-edge military equipment to governments worldwide. His calloused hands, scarred from years of metalwork and experimentation, moved with practiced precision over the Kevlar titanium composite. Alexander wasn't just an inventor. He was a perfectionist who tested every piece of equipment himself. His motto had always been simple: if I wouldn't trust it with my life, no soldier should. The workshop occupied the entire basement of his sprawling estate in the hills outside Denver. Rows of prototypes lined the walls: weapons, armor, surveillance equipment, each representing millions in potential contracts. But Alexander's true passion lay in the defensive technologies. Having lost his father, a Marine sergeant, to an IED in Afghanistan when Alexander was just 16, he dedicated his life to keeping soldiers alive. "Still working, darling?" The voice belonged to his wife of 12 years, Natasha. She descended the stairs with the fluid grace that had first caught his attention at a Defense Department gala. At 34, she remained stunning. Raven black hair, piercing green eyes, and a smile that could disarm a room full of generals. She'd been a Pentagon liaison then, brilliant in her own right with a master's degree in international relations. "Almost finished," Alexander replied, not looking up from his work. Their marriage had grown distant over the past 2 years, but he attributed it to his obsessive work schedule and her demanding job at the State Department. "This could revolutionize personal protection for our special forces." Natasha approached, running her finger along the armor's surface. "You always were too focused on saving people, Alex. Sometimes I wonder if you care more about your soldiers than your own wife." Alexander finally looked up, studying her face. Something in her tone felt off, but he pushed the thought aside. "You know that's not true. Everything I do for us. For our future." "Our future," she repeated, her voice carrying an odd inflection. "Yes, I suppose it is all about that, isn't it?" Before Alexander could respond, footsteps echoed from upstairs. Heavy, unfamiliar. Alexander's military training kicked in. He recognized the cadence of tactical boots. "Expecting someone?" he asked. Natasha's smile widened, but it wasn't the warm expression he remembered. "You could say that. Alex, I'd like you to meet Troy Devine." The man who descended the stairs was everything Alexander wasn't. 6'4", built like a linebacker, with the predatory grace of someone comfortable with violence. Troy wore expensive clothes that couldn't quite hide the bulge of a shoulder holster, and his cold blue eyes swept the workshop with professional assessment. "Mr. Kramer," Troy said, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "I've heard so much about you." Alexander's instincts screamed danger. His hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the workbench where he kept a Glock 19, but Troy was faster. "I wouldn't," Troy said, producing a .45 caliber pistol with smooth efficiency. "We're here to have a conversation." "About what?" Alexander kept his voice steady, his mind racing through possibilities. Natasha moved to stand beside Troy, her hand resting on his arm with familiar intimacy. The gesture hit Alexander like a physical blow. "About life insurance policies," Troy said with a cold smile. "About accidents that happen to brilliant but careless inventors. About widows who inherit everything." Alexander felt the pieces clicking into place. Natasha's distance, the mysterious phone calls, her insistence on updating their insurance policies last month. "How long?" he asked, looking at his wife. 2 years. Natasha replied without shame. "Since you became so obsessed with your work that you forgot you had a wife. And you thought murder was the solution?" Troy laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Murder? This is going to be a tragic accident. Brilliant inventor working alone in his workshop. Gas leak, explosion. Very sad, very believable." Alexander's eyes flicked to the prototype armor on the workbench, then back to Troy. "You've thought this through." "Oh, we have," Natasha said. "Troy is very thorough. He's handled situations like this before." Troy's grip on the pistol never wavered. Your wife will be devastated, of course. The grieving widow. But she'll have your entire fortune to comfort her. $50 million makes grief much more bearable. Alexander nodded slowly, as if accepting his fate. I suppose it does. Just one question. Who are you really, Troy? Let's just say I solve problems for people with money, Troy replied. And your wife has promised me a very generous fee for solving her problem. Alexander looked at Natasha one last time. The woman he'd loved, cherished, provided for. She stared back with nothing but cold calculation. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside him. The last vestiges of the man who believed in love and trust died in that basement workshop. I see, Alexander said quietly. Well then, I suppose there's nothing left to discuss. Troy raised the pistol. Finally, some acceptance. This will be quick, I promise. But as Troy's finger tightened on the trigger, Alexander made his move. Chapter 2. The Web of Deception. 6 months earlier, Natasha Kramer had been a woman torn between duty and desire. Her marriage to Alexander had been built on mutual respect and shared ambition. But somewhere along the way, passion had withered into routine. While her husband lost himself in his inventions, she found herself increasingly isolated in their sprawling home. The State Department job that had once excited her now felt like a cage. She coordinated defense contracts, managed international relationships, and attended endless meetings where she was often the smartest person in the room, but rarely the one making decisions. At 34, she felt her life slipping away one bureaucratic day at a time. That's when she met Troy Devine. He'd appeared at a classified briefing about weapons procurement, introduced as a security consultant with an impressive but vague resume. Troy had served in Delta Force, worked private security in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now operated in the gray areas where government needs met private solutions. Their first conversation had been professional, Natasha questioning the ethics of certain enhanced interrogation equipment purchases. Troy had impressed her not with bravado, but with intelligence. He understood the moral complexities of modern warfare better than the generals who made the policies. You're not what I expected, she told him over coffee after the meeting. What did you expect? A typical military contractor. All testosterone and no brain. Troy's laugh had been genuine. I leave the testosterone to younger men. At 36, I prefer strategy to brute force. What followed was 3 months of intellectual seduction. Troy understood her frustrations with her marriage, her career, her life. He listened when Alexander no longer did. He challenged her mind when her husband only shared technical specifications. The physical affair began during a conference in Las Vegas. Natasha had convinced herself it was just sex, a temporary escape from a loveless marriage. But Troy had larger plans. Your husband is worth $50 million, he'd said one evening as they lay in a hotel room. And you're essentially his secretary. I'm not his secretary, Natasha protested. Then what are you? A wife he ignores? A brilliant woman wasted on someone who cares more about metal and Kevlar than human connection? Troy had done his homework. He knew about Alexander's will, his life insurance, his business structure. More importantly, he understood that Natasha's name was on everything, a gesture of trust that would become the foundation of betrayal. $50 million could buy you freedom, Troy continued. Real freedom, not this gilded cage you're living in. Are you suggesting I divorce him? I'm suggesting you think about what you really want from life and what you're willing to do to get it. The idea had grown slowly in Natasha's mind like a cancer. At first, she dismissed it as fantasy. But as Alexander became more obsessed with his work, as their conversations dwindled to logistics about household management, the fantasy began to feel like necessity. Troy had connections, people who could make problems disappear. He'd done it before, he told her. Rich spouses with inconvenient partners. The key was making it look accidental. Your husband's workshop is perfect, Troy explained during one of their planning sessions. Gas leak, electrical fire, explosion. Tragic accident. The brilliant inventor, too focused on his work to notice the danger. Natasha had insisted on certain conditions. It had to be quick. She wouldn't have Alexander suffer. And it had to be absolutely certain. She couldn't risk him surviving and discovering their betrayal. He's not stupid, she warned Troy. Alexander is brilliant. If he suspects anything, he won't, Troy assured her. Men like your husband live in their heads. They don't see threats in their own homes. But Troy had underestimated Alexander Kramer. As autumn progressed, Natasha found herself studying her husband with new eyes. She noticed things she'd missed before, how his hand always rested near his weapon when strangers were present, how his eyes tracked movement with military precision, how he tested every piece of equipment obsessively. He's more dangerous than you think, she told Troy one afternoon. Every man is dangerous until he's dead, Troy replied. That's why we're not taking chances. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Troy would enter through the back entrance while Natasha distracted Alexander in his workshop. A simple execution, staged as a robbery gone wrong. The security cameras would show an intruder, and Natasha would be the traumatized wife who barely escaped. But plans, no matter how elegant, required perfect execution. On the night they chose, November rain drummed against the windows of the Kramer estate. Natasha descended to the workshop, her heart pounding with anticipation and terror. In a few hours, she would be free and rich beyond her current means. Alexander was working on his latest prototype, completely absorbed in his task. For a moment, Natasha felt a stab of something that might have been regret. This man had loved her, provided for her, trusted her completely. Then she thought about Troy, about freedom, about the life she could build with $50 million. Still working, darling, she said, beginning the performance that would end her marriage. And, she believed, her husband's life. As Troy descended the stairs and began his threats, Natasha watched Alexander's face carefully. She expected fear, pleading, perhaps anger. Instead, she saw something that chilled her more than Troy's gun ever could. She saw calculation. Alexander Kramer was planning something. Chapter 3: Death and Resurrection. The workshop erupted in controlled chaos as Alexander dove behind his workbench. Troy's first shot splintered wood where Alexander's head had been a split second before. The second shot took out a bank of monitors, showering the area with sparks and glass. You're only making this harder on yourself, Kramer, Troy shouted, advancing with professional calm. Come out and let's finish this clean. Alexander's mind raced through possibilities. The workshop had multiple exits, but Troy had positioned himself to cover the main stairway. The emergency exit led to a tunnel system Alexander had installed during construction, a paranoid precaution that might now save his life. Alex, please, Natasha called out, her voice carrying false emotion. Troy doesn't want to hurt you. Just come out and we can discuss this like adults. The hypocrisy of her words, spoken by a woman who'd planned his murder, ignited something cold and permanent in Alexander's chest. Whatever love he'd felt for Natasha crystallized into pure, calculating hatred. Discussion time is over, Alexander called back, his hand closing around the prototype armor he'd been working on. In one fluid motion, he pulled the vest over his head and activated the magnetic clasps. The titanium Kevlar composite settled against his chest like a second skin. Troy appeared around the edge of the workbench, pistol raised. Alexander rolled left as Troy fired, the bullet sparking off a metal cabinet. Alexander came up with a welding torch in his hand, igniting the flame as Troy adjusted his aim. Clever, Troy admitted, keeping his distance. But that torch has maybe a 3-foot range. This pistol has considerably more. Alexander began moving between equipment banks, using the torch to keep Troy at bay while working toward the emergency exit. But Troy was experienced. He'd hunted men before. Instead of following, he moved to cut off escape routes. You know what I don't understand? Troy said conversationally as he maneuvered. How a man smart enough to build military-grade equipment could be stupid enough to trust a woman like Natasha. Alexander paused behind a bank of testing equipment. What do you mean? She's been planning this for months. Every conversation, every touch, every time she said she loved you, it was all calculation. She's quite good at it, actually. Very convincing. Troy, Natasha said sharply. That's enough. Why? He's about to die anyway. Might as well know the truth. Troy's voice grew closer. She picked me specifically, Kramer. Researched my background, made contact through her State Department connections. Your wife is a very thorough woman. Alexander absorbed this information, filing it away for later use. The emergency exit was 20 feet away, but he'd have to cross open ground to reach it. Of course, Troy continued, the real genius is in the planning. Your death tonight isn't random. It's been orchestrated. The security guard you trust? They've been given the night off. The alarm system? Mysteriously malfunctioned this afternoon. Even the weather is perfect. This rain will wash away any forensic evidence. Alexander understood now. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was a military-style operation planned with precision and patience, which meant Troy was more dangerous than he'd initially assessed. The only thing I couldn't account for, Troy said, his voice indicating he was moving closer, was your equipment. Some of this stuff is impressive. Military grade. Almost makes me want to keep you alive long enough to demonstrate it. Alexander made his decision. In one explosive movement, he launched himself from cover, welding torch blazing. Troy was ready. He'd been expecting exactly this move. The pistol barked 3 times in rapid succession. 3.45 caliber bullets slammed into Alexander's chest with devastating force. The impact drove him backward, the welding torch flying from his hand to clatter across the concrete floor. Alexander collapsed, gasping, staring up at the ceiling as Troy and Natasha approached. 3 shots to the chest, Troy said with satisfaction, checking Alexander's pulse with professional thoroughness. He's finished. Natasha stared down at the man she'd lived with for 12 years. Blood was beginning to pool beneath him, and his breathing had become shallow and erratic. Now we are rich, Troy said, holstering his weapon. Time to call the police and start your grieving widow performance. They left Alexander bleeding on the concrete floor and headed upstairs to prepare their story. The rain continued to drum against the high windows, and thunder masked any sounds from below. What they didn't know, what Troy's professional paranoia hadn't accounted for, was that Alexander Kramer tested every piece of equipment personally. The prototype armor he wore hadn't just been designed to stop .50 caliber rounds. It had been tested, refined, and perfected over months of careful work. The 3 bullets had penetrated the outer layer of Kevlar, but been stopped cold by the titanium composite core. The impacts had knocked the wind from Alexander's lungs and would leave massive bruises, but the armor had performed exactly as designed. Alexander lay still for 10 minutes, listening to footsteps above, waiting for his breathing to return to normal. Then he carefully rolled over and examined the bullets that had fallen to the floor. .45 caliber, hollow point, designed to cause maximum damage. He stood slowly, removing the armor and examining the impact points. 3 perfect impressions in the titanium, but no penetration. The vest had saved his life, just as he'd known it would. From upstairs, he could hear Natasha's voice, high and panicked, speaking to someone on the phone. Please send someone quickly. There's been a break-in. My husband. I think he's been shot. Alexander smiled grimly. His wife was an excellent actress. Moving silently, he activated the emergency exit and slipped into the tunnel system that connected his workshop to a hidden exit half a mile away. Behind him, sirens were beginning to wail in the distance. By the time police arrived to find Alexander Kramer's body, missing and blood evidence suggesting a wounded man had crawled away to die, Alexander was already gone. The official investigation would conclude that the wounded inventor had somehow escaped, likely dying somewhere in the wilderness during the storm. But Alexander Kramer hadn't died in that workshop. The man who believed in love, trust, and human decency, that man was dead. What emerged from the tunnel into the cold November rain was something far more dangerous. A predator with unlimited resources, military training, and nothing left to lose. The real Alexander Kramer had been forged in that moment of betrayal, tempered by his wife's calculated cruelty and Troy's professional brutality. Now it was time for them to meet the monster they had created. Chapter 4. The Phoenix Rises. 3 weeks after his supposed death, Alexander Kramer sat in a rented warehouse in the industrial district of Cleveland, studying surveillance photographs of his own funeral. The images showed Natasha in black, weeping convincingly as she accepted condolences from business associates, government officials, and friends who had no idea they were mourning a man very much alive. Troy Devine stood beside her in the photos, playing the role of supportive friend, the security consultant who had tried to save her husband but arrived too late. His performance was flawless, his grief appropriately restrained but genuine seeming. Alexander set the photographs aside and returned to his work. The warehouse had become his new workshop, equipped with everything he needed for the project that would consume the next phase of his life. He'd purchased the building through a shell company, using accounts Natasha knew nothing about, preparation for a paranoia that had proven justified. His reflection in the black computer screen showed a changed man. Alexander had lost 20 pounds in 3 weeks, his face gaunt from stress and determination. A beard now covered his jaw, and he'd dyed his hair dark brown. But the most significant change was in his eyes. The warmth and humanity that had once defined him had been replaced by something cold and calculating. The official investigation into his disappearance had concluded exactly as planned. The FBI had found evidence of a struggle, blood loss consistent with serious injury, and a trail leading into the wilderness. With no body recovered and winter storms destroying any potential evidence, Alexander Kramer had been declared legally dead. His estate, valued at $52 million, had passed to his loving widow. Alexander had spent the weeks since his death planning. Not the quick, violent revenge that his rage demanded, but something far more sophisticated. Troy Natasha had destroyed his old life with careful planning and patience. He would return the favor. A knock at the warehouse door interrupted his thoughts. Alexander checked the security monitors, then opened the door to admit Gene Briggs, a former Delta Force operator who'd served under his father in Afghanistan. "You look like hell, Alex," Gene said, studying his old friend's transformed appearance. "I feel worse," Alexander replied. "Thank you for coming." Gene had been Alexander's first recruitment. At 42, he was a veteran of 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, with skills in surveillance, infiltration, and what the military euphemistically called direct action. More importantly, he was one of the few people who'd known Alexander's father personally. "Still can't believe it," Gene said, accepting a cup of coffee. "Natasha seemed like such a decent woman." "That was her greatest weapon," Alexander replied. "I trusted her completely, shared everything with her, gave her access to accounts, security codes, business information. She knew exactly how to destroy me because I taught her how. And this Troy character?" Alexander activated a wall-mounted display showing Troy's photograph and service record. Real name Troy Devine, age 36. Delta Force for 8 years, private military contractor for 6. Specialized in what he calls problem resolution. Gene studied the information. Translation: he kills people for money. Very good at it, from what I've learned. My death wouldn't have been his first, and it certainly wouldn't have been his last. Alexander pulled up additional files. "I've identified at least 4 other cases where wealthy spouses died under suspicious circumstances, and Troy was somewhere in the vicinity." "You think Natasha knows?" "I think Natasha is many things, but naive isn't one of them. She chose Troy specifically because he could do what she couldn't. My wife may be a calculating sociopath, but she's not a killer. She needed someone who was." Gene leaned back in his chair. "So what's the plan?" Alexander smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. "Destruction. Complete and total. I'm going to take apart their lives piece by piece, just like they took apart mine. And then they die." The simplicity of Alexander's statement chilled Gene more than any elaborate threat could have. This wasn't the brilliant but idealistic engineer he'd known for years. This was someone else entirely. "Alex, I have to ask, are you sure about this? I mean, really sure? Because once we start down this road..." "They left me bleeding in an alley, Gene. My wife stood over me while her lover put 3 bullets in my chest. They thought I was dying, and instead of calling for help, they walked away discussing how rich they were going to be." Alexander's voice remained steady, but Gene could see the fury burning behind his eyes. "Whatever mercy I might have shown died in that workshop." Gene nodded slowly. "Okay, What do you need from me? Alexander activated another display, showing detailed floor plans and surveillance photos. Troy and Natasha think they're untouchable. They've covered their tracks, established their alibis, and they're beginning to enjoy their new life. That complacency is going to be their downfall. The display showed Natasha's new routine. She'd moved into a downtown penthouse, citing too many painful memories in the family home. Troy maintained his own apartment, but spent most nights with her. Both had been careful not to appear too comfortable too quickly, maintaining the fiction of grief while gradually transitioning into their new life. Phase 1 is surveillance and intelligence gathering. Alexander continued. I need to know everything about their routines, their security measures, their weaknesses. More importantly, I need to understand their relationship dynamic. You think they might turn on each other? I'm counting on it. Natasha is intelligent but emotionally volatile. Troy is a professional killer, but he's also greedy and arrogant. Partnerships like theirs are inherently unstable, especially when there's $50 million at stake. Jean studied the surveillance photos more carefully. They look pretty cozy to me. For now. But Troy killed 3 people to get that money, and Natasha betrayed the man who loved her most in the world. What do you think they'll do to each other when pressure is applied? Alexander pulled up another set of files, financial records, communication intercepts, travel schedules. The depth of intelligence was impressive, showing months of careful preparation. How long have you been planning this? Jean asked. Since the moment I pulled those bullets out of my chest armor, Alexander replied. I've spent 3 weeks learning everything there is to know about my enemies. Their bank accounts, their habits, their fears, their secrets. By the time I'm finished with them, they'll beg me to end their lives. Jean looked at his old friend with new understanding. The Alexander Kramer he'd known had been a brilliant engineer and a decent man. This version was something far more dangerous, a predator with unlimited resources and nothing left to lose. When do we start? Jean asked. Alexander turned back to his computers, already pulling up the next phase of his plan. We already have. Troy and Natasha just don't know it yet. Chapter 5. Allies in the Shadows. The abandoned church on the outskirts of Detroit served as an unlikely meeting place for a gathering that would have terrified federal law enforcement. Alexander had chosen the location carefully, remote enough for privacy, but with multiple escape routes and clear sight lines in all directions. Jean arrived first, followed 10 minutes later by 2 other men who moved with the fluid grace of experienced operators. Alexander watched from the shadows as his recruits took defensive positions around the church interior, their military training evident in every movement. Sh0t emerged from behind the altar, his weathered face creased in a grim smile. At 45, Ray had been a Marine Force recon veteran before transitioning to private security work. He'd lost his left eye to an IED in Fallujah, but the remaining brown eye still held the predatory alertness of a natural hunter. Alex, Ray said, clasping his hand. Jean told me you were dead. I was, Alexander replied. Now I'm something else. The second man, Willie Casey, approached with more caution. At 39, Willie had been a Navy SEAL before personal demons and a bad divorce had led him into darker waters. He was smaller than the others, but radiated the coiled tension of a man comfortable with violence. This better be worth my time, Kramer, Willie said. I don't do charity work. Alexander smiled coldly. This isn't charity. This is business. Very profitable business. He activated a portable projector, filling the church wall with images of Troy and Natasha. These people tried to kill me. They destroyed my life, stole my fortune, and thought they could get away with it. I'm here to prove them wrong. Ray studied the photographs with professional interest. The woman's your wife? Was my wife. Now she's a target. And the man, Troy Devine, professional killer. Delta Force background, private military experience. He's good at what he does. Willie's interest sharpened. How good? Alexander pulled up Troy's service record and known operations. Good enough to have killed at least 4 people in similar circumstances. Good enough to put 3 bullets in my chest and walk away convinced I was dead. But you're not dead, Ray observed. No, and that's going to be their first big surprise. Alexander changed the projection to show detailed plans and financial information. Gentlemen, I'm offering you each $5 million to help me destroy the people who try to murder me. The silence that followed was profound. $5 million was more money than any of them had ever seen in one place. What's the catch? Willie asked suspiciously. No catch. Just requirements. First, this operation will likely take months to complete. I want total destruction, not quick revenge. Second, it will probably be illegal. Very illegal. Third, when I'm finished with Troy and Natasha, they will both be dead. Ray leaned back against the pew. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about justice. They tried to kill me for money. I'm going to return the favor. Jean stepped forward. I've seen the evidence. These people are monsters. They deserve whatever Alex has planned for them. Willie studied the financial projections Alexander had provided. $5 million each? You can afford that. I can afford much more. My death freed up assets that Natasha doesn't know about. Foreign accounts, shell companies, investments made through proxies. I'm richer dead than I ever was alive. Ray walked to the front of the church, studying the detailed plans Alexander had developed. This is sophisticated, military-level planning. You're not just talking about killing them. You want to break them first. Completely. I want them to lose everything that matters to them before they lose their lives. Alexander activated another projection showing a timeline of operations. Phase 1 is complete, surveillance and intelligence gathering. We know their routines, their security measures, their weaknesses. Phase 2 begins tomorrow, psychological warfare. Meaning, Willie asked, meaning we start making their lives very uncomfortable. Small things at first, mysterious problems that can't be easily explained. The goal is to create paranoia and distrust between them. Ray nodded approvingly. Divide and conquer. Exactly. Troy and Natasha are partners, but they're also natural enemies. He's a killer who's attracted to her money. She's a manipulator who thinks she can control him. Under enough pressure, they'll turn on each other. Alexander pulled up surveillance footage from the past week. Look at this. They're already showing stress. Natasha's drinking more, sleeping less. Troy's becoming more aggressive, more controlling. They're sitting on $50 million, but they can't enjoy it because they're constantly looking over their shoulders. Jean studied the footage carefully. They're scared someone will discover what they did. Which brings us to Phase 3, Alexander continued. While they're dealing with psychological pressure, we'll be systematically destroying their financial resources. Bank accounts will be frozen due to irregularities. Investments will fail due to market fluctuations. Their luxury lifestyle will crumble piece by piece. Willie was beginning to look impressed. In Phase 4, Alexander's smile was genuinely terrifying. Phase 4 is when they learn that I'm still alive. Can you imagine their reaction? The man they murdered standing in front of them, very much alive and extremely angry. Ray whistled softly. That's going to be one hell of a surprise. It gets better. By the time I reveal myself, they'll have lost everything. Their money, their security, their trust in each other. They'll be desperate, paranoid, and completely isolated. Perfect conditions for the final phase. Which is, Willie prompted, justice. Permanent and final. Alexander turned off the projector and faced his recruits directly. Gentlemen, I'm offering you the chance to be part of something extraordinary. Not just a revenge operation, but a work of art. These people thought they could destroy me and walk away rich and happy. I'm going to prove that some betrayals carry consequences that money can't fix. Jean stepped forward first. I'm in. Your father was a good man, Alex. Anyone who tried to kill his son deserves whatever's coming to them. Ray nodded. Count me in. I've been looking for something meaningful to do with my skills. This qualifies. All eyes turned to Willie, who was still studying the financial projections. $5 million, he said finally. Plus expenses? Plus expenses, Alexander confirmed. Willie grinned. When do we start? Alexander looked around at his assembled team. 3 of the most dangerous men he'd ever known, united in a common cause. We already have. Troy and Natasha just don't know it yet. As the meeting broke up and his allies melted back into the night, Alexander remained in the abandoned church for a few minutes longer. Tomorrow would begin the systematic destruction of everything Troy and Natasha held dear. They had created a monster when they betrayed him. Now it was time for the monster to introduce itself. Chapter 6: The Web Titans. Natasha Kramer woke in her downtown penthouse to the sound of breaking glass. She bolted upright in bed, her heart racing as she reached for the bedside lamp. Troy was already moving, his military training evident as he rolled from the bed and came up with a pistol in his hand. "Stay here," he whispered, moving toward the bedroom door with professional silence. Natasha watched him disappear into the hallway, then grabbed her robe and crept to the window. 20 floors below, downtown Denver sparkled in the pre-dawn darkness. Everything looked normal from her vantage point. No signs of disturbance on the street level. Troy returned 5 minutes later, his expression grim. "Someone threw a brick through the kitchen window, but there's no sign of forced entry and nothing's missing." "A brick?" Natasha asked, her voice shaky, with a message tied to it. Troy held up a piece of paper with words cut from magazines. "You can't hide from the truth." Natasha sank onto the bed, her hands trembling. "It's probably just a random prank. Some drunk college kid, or at 3 in the morning? 20 floors up." Troy's voice was skeptical. Someone had to have serious equipment to get a brick through that window from street level. This was the third incident in 2 weeks. First, someone had sent Natasha photographs of herself and Troy taken with a telephoto lens, intimate moments captured without their knowledge. Then Troy's apartment had been broken into, though nothing was stolen. Now this. "Maybe we should call the police," Natasha suggested. Troy's laugh was harsh. "And tell them what? That we're being harassed by someone who might know we committed murder? That's not going to end well for us." Natasha flinched at his casual mention of Alexander's death. She'd been trying not to think about that night, but the guilt was eating at her. In quiet moments, she could still see her husband's face as he realized her betrayal, the hurt and confusion in his eyes. "I never wanted him to suffer," she said quietly. Troy studied her with cold blue eyes. "You wanted him dead, and he's dead. The method is irrelevant. He was a good man, Troy. Maybe we could have found another way." "Stop." Troy's voice was sharp. "There was no other way. Your husband was worth $50 million, and he wasn't going to give it to you voluntarily. We did what we had to do." Natasha wrapped her arms around herself. "Then why do I feel like we're being watched all the time? Why can't I sleep? Why do I jump every time the phone rings?" "Because you're feeling guilty about something that was completely justified," Troy said, sitting beside her on the bed. "Rich men die every day, Natasha. Some from heart attacks, some from accidents, some from people like me. Your husband was no different." But Natasha was beginning to think Alexander had been very different indeed. In the weeks since his death, she'd learned things about her husband that she'd never known. Hidden bank accounts, security measures, backup plans he'd never mentioned. Alexander had been far more paranoid and far better prepared than she'd realized. What if he knew? She asked suddenly. What if Alexander suspected something and made preparations? Troy's expression hardened. "He's dead, Natasha. I put 3 bullets in his chest and watched him bleed out on that concrete floor. Whatever preparations he might have made died with him. But his body was never found, because it's at the bottom of some ravine in the wilderness. Animals have probably scattered the bones by now." Troy stood and walked to the window, checking the street below with professional paranoia. "You need to stop second-guessing what we did. We planned it perfectly, executed it flawlessly, and now we're rich. End of story." But it wasn't the end of the story, and both of them knew it. The harassment had started small: wrong number phone calls at odd hours, deliveries they hadn't ordered, mysterious charges on credit cards that were later reversed. Individually, each incident could be explained as coincidence or minor annoyance. Together, they formed a pattern that suggested someone was playing games with them. Troy's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. He read it, and his face went pale. "What?" Natasha asked. Troy showed her the screen. The message was from an unknown number, but the content was chilling. 3 bullets to the chest. "He's finished. Now we are rich." Those were Troy's exact words from the night of Alexander's murder. Someone was listening, Natasha whispered. Troy was already moving, checking windows and doors with systematic thoroughness. Impossible. I swept that house for surveillance equipment before we moved. The only people who heard those words were you and me. Then how? Another text arrived, this one with an attached photograph. It showed Troy and Natasha in the workshop, standing over Alexander's supposedly dead body. The image quality was grainy, but clear enough to be damning evidence. Troy's hands shook as he deleted the messages. We need to leave. Now. Leave? Where are we going to go? Somewhere safe while I figure out who's doing this. Troy was already packing, his movements sharp and efficient. Someone knows what we did, and they're playing with us. That means we're in danger. Natasha watched him pack, weapons along with clothes. You think they want money? Blackmail? I don't know what they want, but I'm not waiting around to find out. Troy stopped packing and looked at her directly. Natasha, I need you to understand something. If someone has evidence of what we did, they have the power to destroy us both. That makes them extremely dangerous. So what are you saying? I'm saying that whoever is doing this might have to be eliminated, just like Alexander was. Natasha felt a chill that had nothing to do with a broken window. You mean murdered? I mean neutralized. Whatever threat they represent needs to be removed permanently. As Troy continued packing, Natasha wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Alexander had been predictable, trustworthy, even in his obsession with work. Troy was something else entirely, a man who killed problems rather than solving them. And now someone else was playing the same game Troy had taught her. The third text message arrived as they were leaving the penthouse. Did you really think you could get away with murder? Troy stared at the screen for a long moment, then smashed the phone against the wall. Whoever you are, he said to the empty room, you just made the last mistake of your life. But in a surveillance van 3 blocks away, Alexander Kramer smiled as he watched them flee through high-powered cameras. Phase 2 was proceeding exactly as planned. The psychological pressure was working. Troy and Natasha were scared, paranoid, and beginning to make mistakes. Soon, they would be desperate enough for Phase 3. And then the real fun would begin. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The safe house Troy had chosen was a remote cabin in the Colorado mountains, 40 miles from the nearest town and accessible only by a winding dirt road. It was the kind of place where someone could disappear completely or where someone could be made to disappear. Natasha stood at the cabin window, watching snow fall through the pine trees. 3 days in isolation had given her too much time to think, and her thoughts kept returning to the same terrifying possibility. Someone knew exactly what they had done. Any word from your contacts? She asked Troy, who was cleaning weapons at the kitchen table. Still working on it. Troy replied without looking up. But I got some leads. Someone's been asking questions about us in certain circles. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests they know more than they should. Troy's voice was grim. Professional questions. Someone with serious resources is investigating us. Natasha felt her stomach tighten. You think it's law enforcement? No. Cops would have arrested us by now if they had evidence. This is something else. Someone private. The satellite phone on the table rang, making both of them jump. Troy answered it cautiously. Yeah. He listened for a moment, then his face went white. You're sure? Absolutely sure? Another pause. Okay, thanks. He hung up and stared at Natasha with an expression she'd never seen before. Genuine fear. What? She demanded. That was my contact at the FBI. Someone's been making inquiries about Alexander's death investigation, asking for files, forensic reports, witness statements. A private investigator? No. Someone with government clearance high enough to access classified materials. Troy set down his pistol and looked at her directly. Natasha, someone with serious connections, is investigating your husband's murder. The implications hit her like a physical blow. You think Alexander had allies we didn't know about? I think your husband was more connected than we realized. Military contracts, government work, classified projects. He had relationships we never considered. Natasha sank into a chair as the full weight of their situation became clear. They'd assumed Alexander was an isolated genius with no one to miss him except his wife. But what if he'd had friends in dangerous places? People who wouldn't accept his death without thorough investigation? The satellite phone rang again. This time, Troy let it go to voicemail. When he played back the message, a digitally distorted voice filled the cabin. You killed the wrong man, Troy. Alexander Kramer had friends. Powerful friends. And we know what you did. Troy's hand moved instinctively to his weapon. We need to leave. Now, where are we going to go? If someone with government connections is after us. There are places, Troy interrupted. Countries with no extradition treaties. People who can provide new identities for the right price. You want us to become fugitives? I want us to stay alive. Troy was already packing again, his movements urgent. Whoever is doing this isn't playing games anymore. That message was a declaration of war. As if summoned by his words, the lights went out. The cabin plunged into complete darkness, the only illumination coming from the snow-reflected moonlight through the windows. Troy drew his pistol and moved to the window, peering into the forest. "See anything?" Natasha whispered. "Nothing. But they're out there." The silence stretched for several minutes, broken only by the wind through the pine trees. Then a new sound reached them, a vehicle approaching up the dirt road. Troy cursed softly. "Get to the back bedroom. There's a rifle in the closet and a back window you can climb through if necessary." "Troy, go. Now." Natasha retreated to the bedroom as Troy positioned himself by the front window. The vehicle, it sounded like a truck, came to a stop outside the cabin. Doors slammed, and voices carried through the cold air. "We know you're in there," a man called out. "Come out with your hands visible, and maybe we can discuss this civilly." Troy recognized the voice from the distorted phone message. He also recognized the tactical positioning of whoever was outside. They'd surrounded the cabin with professional efficiency. "Who are you?" Troy shouted back. "Friends of Alexander Kramer. And we have some questions about his death. Alexander Kramer died in a home invasion. I was hired to investigate his murder." Laughter echoed from the darkness. "That's a good story, Troy. Too bad we know better." A spotlight suddenly blazed through the window, blinding Troy momentarily. When his vision cleared, he could see armed figures positioned around the cabin perimeter. "You have 10 seconds to come out," the voice called. "After that, we come in." Troy made his decision. Instead of surrendering, he opened fire through the front window, his shots sparking off the spotlight and sending the attackers diving for cover. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Automatic weapons fire shattered every window in the cabin, filling the air with splinters and broken glass. Troy rolled away from the front window as bullets chewed through the wooden walls. From the bedroom, Natasha screamed as bullets punched through the exterior wall. Troy army crawled toward the back of the cabin, but the gunfire was coming from all directions now. "Natasha," he yelled, "the back window!" But when he reached the bedroom, he found it empty. The back window was open, cold air streaming through. Natasha had escaped into the forest. Troy's relief was short-lived. The gunfire stopped abruptly, replaced by an ominous silence. Then the front door exploded inward, and tactical lights cut through the darkness. "Clear!" Voices shouted as armed figures swept through the cabin. Troy had one advantage. He knew the cabin's layout in the dark. He slipped into the basement through a concealed trapdoor, then made his way to a tunnel that led to an exterior root cellar. But as he emerged from the tunnel, a rifle muzzle pressed against the back of his neck. "Troy Devine," a familiar voice said. "We meet again." Troy turned slowly and found himself face to face with a man he thought was dead. Alexander Kramer stood in the moonlight, very much alive, wearing military fatigues and holding an assault rifle with casual competence. His face was leaner than Troy remembered, his eyes harder, but he was unmistakably the man Troy had shot 3 times in the chest. "Impossible," Troy whispered. Alexander smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Prototype body armor. I designed it myself. Turns out it works quite well against .45 caliber pistol rounds." The reality of the situation crashed over Troy like a physical blow. "You've been alive this whole time." "Very much so. And I've been watching you and my dear wife enjoy the fortune you stole from me." Alexander's voice was conversational, but Troy could hear the controlled rage beneath. $50 million. That's what my life was worth to you, wasn't it? Troy's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Alexander was faster. The rifle but caught him across the temple, dropping him to his knees. I wouldn't, Alexander advised. My friends have you surrounded, and they're very eager to discuss your recent activities. From the forest, Natasha's scream echoed through the night. Troy looked up to see her being escorted out of the trees by two armed men, her hands zip-tied behind her back. When she saw Alexander, her face went white with shock and terror. "Hello, darling," Alexander said pleasantly. "Did you miss me?" As Troy and Natasha were forced to their knees in the snow, Alexander walked slowly around them, savoring the moment he'd been planning for months. "I have to admit," he said, "you two put together an impressive plan. Very thorough, very professional. If it weren't for one small detail, it would have worked perfectly." "What detail?" Troy asked. Alexander smiled. "You assumed I trusted my wife completely. But the truth is, I stopped trusting Natasha months ago. Her phone calls, her mysterious absences, her sudden interest in our finances. I knew something was wrong." Natasha stared at him in horror. "You knew." "I suspected. So I took precautions. Backup plans, hidden assets, insurance policies." Alexander's voice grew colder. "What I didn't expect was that my wife would try to have me murdered. That was a surprise, I'll admit." Troy was calculating odds, looking for an escape route. But Alexander's men had positioned themselves with military precision, blocking every avenue of retreat. "So what now?" Troy asked. "You're going to kill us?" Alexander appeared to consider the question seriously. "Eventually. But first, I want you to experience something that you put me through, the complete destruction of everything you hold dear." He gestured to his men, who began moving toward their vehicles. "You see, Troy, Natasha, this is just the beginning. What you've experienced so far, the harassment, the surveillance, the fear, that was nothing compared to what's coming next." As they were loaded into separate vehicles, Alexander leaned close to Natasha's ear. "I loved you," he whispered. "I would have given you anything. But you chose greed over love and betrayal over loyalty. Now you're going to learn what that choice really costs." The convoy pulled away from the burning cabin, carrying Troy and Natasha toward a fate that would make their original plan seem merciful by comparison. Behind them, the mountains kept their secrets, and Alexander Kramer's revenge entered its final, most brutal phase. Chapter 8. The Price of Betrayal. The warehouse where Alexander brought his prisoners had been modified specifically for this purpose. Soundproof walls, controlled ventilation, and no exterior windows. It was the kind of place where screams would go unheard and where people could disappear without a trace. Troy and Natasha were secured in separate rooms, each chained to a chair, but able to see each other through a large one-way mirror. Alexander wanted them to witness each other's suffering, psychological torture as effective as any physical pain. "Welcome to your new home," Alexander said, his voice carrying through speakers into both rooms. "I do hope you'll be comfortable. You're going to be here for quite some time." Through the mirror, Troy could see Natasha straining against her restraints, terror evident in every line of her body. He'd been trained to resist interrogation, but watching someone else suffer was far harder than enduring it himself. "What do you want from us?" Troy shouted. Alexander's voice remained calm and conversational. "I want you to understand something, Troy. When you tried to kill me, you made a fundamental error in judgment. You assumed I was just another rich civilian, soft, weak, unprepared for violence." Images began playing on screens mounted around both rooms. Security footage from the workshop, showing the night of the murder attempt in brutal detail. "But you see," Alexander continued, "I'm not just a defense contractor. I'm a man who designs weapons for people who kill for a living. I understand violence. I've studied it, perfected it, and now I'm going to demonstrate it." The footage showed Troy's 3 shots, Alexander's fall, and the moment when Troy and Natasha left him for dead. But new camera angles revealed something Troy hadn't known. Alexander putting on the prototype armor just before the confrontation began. "You were set up from the moment you entered my house," Alexander explained. "I knew what you were planning because I know my wife better than she knows herself. Natasha can't hide her emotions, and she'd been broadcasting guilt and excitement for weeks." Natasha's voice came through the speakers, high and desperate. "Alex, please. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did hurt me, Alexander replied. Profoundly. Not just the bullets. Those were nothing. You hurt me by destroying 12 years of love and trust. By choosing greed over loyalty. By proving that everything I believed about you was a lie. Jean Briggs entered the observation room, where Alexander was monitoring his prisoners. The financial transfers are complete. Every account they had access to has been emptied. Alexander nodded without taking his eyes off the monitors. How much? 52 million in total. Their stolen fortune has been redistributed to military charities and veterans organizations. They're completely broke. On the screens, Alexander could see Troy testing his restraints with professional thoroughness. The former Delta Force operator was looking for weaknesses, escape routes, anything that might give him an advantage. Troy, Alexander said through the speakers, you're wasting your time. Those restraints were designed by the same man who created the armor that saved my life. They're quite literally unbreakable. Troy stopped struggling and stared directly at the camera. You want to kill us? Then do it. Stop playing games. Oh, but I enjoy the games, Troy. And we're just getting started. Alexander activated another set of screens, these showing live footage from locations around the country. Tell me, do you recognize these places? Troy's face went pale as he saw surveillance footage of his sister's house in Phoenix, his elderly mother's apartment in Chicago, and his nephew's college dormitory in California. You see, I've spent considerable time researching your background, your family, your friends, everyone you care about. Just like you research mine. Leave them out of this, Troy snarled. They had nothing to do with what happened. Neither did I initially, but that didn't stop you from trying to murder me. Alexander's voice grew colder. However, I'm not like you, Troy. I don't hurt innocent people. Your family is safe, as long as you cooperate. Alexander switched the focus to Natasha's room. Now, my dear wife, let's discuss your situation. Do you remember our wedding vows? In sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do us part. Natasha was crying now, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Alex, I never stopped loving you. Stop. Alexander's voice cut through her pleading like a blade. Don't insult my intelligence with lies. You stopped loving me the moment you met Troy. Everything after that was calculation. Sh0t entered the observation room, carrying a tablet with updated intelligence reports. We've finished the background investigation on both targets. You're going to find this interesting. Alexander glanced at the report, then smiled grimly. It seems my wife and her lover have been keeping secrets from each other. Natasha, did you know that Troy's been married before? 3 times, in fact. Through the speakers, they could hear Natasha's sharp intake of breath. All 3 of his previous wives died under mysterious circumstances, Alexander continued. House fires, car accidents, boating mishaps. Always with substantial life insurance policies. It seems you weren't Troy's first victim, Natasha. This is most recent. On the monitor, Troy's expression had turned murderous. You son of a bitch. And Troy, did you know that Natasha has been skimming money from her State Department position for the past 5 years? Selling classified information to foreign contractors? She's been preparing for this betrayal much longer than you realized. The revelation hit Troy like a physical blow. He stared through the mirror at Natasha with new understanding. That's right, Alexander said with satisfaction. Neither of you is the person the other thought you were. You're both sociopathic killers who thought you'd found the perfect partner. How romantic. Willie Casey joined the group in the observation room. Phase 4 is ready to initiate. All equipment is in place. Alexander nodded. Excellent. Gentlemen, it's time for the final lesson. He activated the speakers again. Troy, Natasha, you're about to learn the difference between murder and justice. Murder is what you attempted, killing an innocent man for money. Justice is what's about to happen to you. The lights in both rooms dimmed, and new equipment descended from the ceiling. Medical monitoring devices for stands and other apparatus that suggested a long, unpleasant process. You see, simply killing you would be mercy, Alexander explained. Instead, you're going to experience exactly what you put me through: betrayal, terror, and the slow realization that people you trusted have become your executioners. Alexander stood and walked toward the door leading to the prisoner chambers. I'm going to break you both, piece by piece, until you beg me to end your lives. And when you do, I'm going to deny you even that mercy. As he reached for the door handle, he turned back to his team. Gentlemen, Phase 4 begins now. By the time we're finished, Troy and Natasha will understand that some betrayals carry consequences that money can't fix. The sound of the door closing behind Alexander echoed through the observation room like a death knell. The final phase of his revenge had begun. Chapter 9. Justice Delivered. 3 months later, the abandoned warehouse held only ghosts and the lingering scent of fear. Alexander stood in the empty room where Troy and Natasha had spent their final weeks, remembering the sounds that had echoed through these walls. Pleading, screaming, and eventually, the blessed silence of acceptance. Gene approached from behind, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. It's finished. Alexander nodded, his face showing no emotion. They made their choice in my workshop that night. Everything that followed was simply the inevitable consequence. The details of those final weeks would remain between Alexander and his prisoners. The psychological warfare had been methodical and complete, turning Troy and Natasha against each other, revealing their deepest secrets and systematically destroying every relationship they valued. Troy had broken first. The man who killed for money discovered that everyone he'd ever cared about now knew exactly what he was. His mother, his sister, his nephew. Alexander had provided them with detailed evidence of Troy's crimes. The professional killer found himself completely alone, abandoned by everyone who had once loved him. Natasha had lasted longer, but her collapse had been more complete. Alexander had methodically revealed her betrayals, not just of their marriage, but of her country, her position, her every moral principle. By the end, she was begging not for mercy, but for forgiveness from a man she'd tried to murder. Any regrets? Gene asked. Alexander considered the question seriously. None. They chose to destroy my life for money. I simply returned the favor. Ray and Willie emerged from the rear of the warehouse, carrying the last of the equipment. The facility would be abandoned now, its purpose served. Within hours, it would be sanitized and forgotten, just another empty building in Detroit's industrial district. What about the bodies? Ray asked. Alexander's smile was cold. What bodies? Troy Devine and Natasha Kramer left the country 3 months ago with stolen money. They're fugitives now, probably hiding somewhere in South America. At least, that's what the evidence suggests. The false trail had been carefully constructed. Passport records, banking transactions, even surveillance footage showing 2 people who resembled Troy and Natasha boarding flights to Brazil. If anyone ever investigated their disappearance, they would find a convincing story of criminals fleeing justice. And the money? Willie asked. Returned to its rightful purposes. Every dollar they stole has been donated to military charities and veterans organizations. Their greed has become a force for good. Alexander walked to the center of the empty room and stood where Troy's chair had been positioned. The man who had tried to kill him had died exactly here, understanding finally that some betrayals carried consequences beyond imagination. You know, Gene said quietly, your father would be proud of what you've accomplished. Alexander shook his head. My father was a good man who believed in justice through proper channels. What I've done here, this was something darker. They tried to murder you for money, Alex. They got what they deserved. Yes, Alexander agreed. They did. As the team prepared to leave the warehouse, Alexander took one final look around. 3 months ago, he'd been a trusting husband and successful businessman. That man had died in his workshop, killed by betrayal and greed. What emerged from this warehouse was something different, harder, colder, but strangely at peace. Troy and Natasha had taught him that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. They'd shown him that even love could be calculated and false. But they'd also taught him something else, that justice, when properly applied, could be more satisfying than any revenge. Where to now? Ray asked as they climbed into their vehicles. Alexander started his engine and looked back at the warehouse one final time. I have a business to rebuild, a life to reconstruct, a future to create. And if someone else tries what Troy and Natasha tried, Alexander's smile was genuinely frightening. Then they'll learn the same lesson. I don't forgive betrayal. I don't forget enemies. And I never, ever make the same mistake twice. As the convoy pulled away from the warehouse, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the peace of forgiveness or reconciliation, but the cold satisfaction of perfect justice. Troy Devine and Natasha Kramer had tried to destroy him for money. Instead, they had created something far more dangerous. A man with unlimited resources, military training, and nothing left to lose. Their betrayal had been the end of Alexander Kramer, the trusting husband. But it had been the birth of Alexander Kramer, the perfect predator. And in a world full of people who thought they could get away with anything, that was a very dangerous development indeed. The warehouse fell silent behind them, keeping its secrets like a grave. In the weeks that followed, urban explorers would report strange sounds echoing from the abandoned building. Whispers of regret, cries for mercy that would never come. But Alexander Kramer never looked back. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that some betrayals demand not forgiveness, but annihilation. And he had become very, very good at delivering exactly that. Epilogue. 5 years later, Alexander Kramer sat at his new office overlooking Denver skyline. Kramer Defense Technologies had grown beyond his original dreams, now employing over 1,000 people and holding contracts worth hundreds of millions. But the real Alexander Kramer, the predator born in betrayal, remained hidden beneath the surface. Watching, waiting, ready. Because in a world full of people who thought they could betray trust and walk away rich, Alexander Kramer had become their worst nightmare. A man who never forgave. A man who never forgot. A man who always, eventually, collected what was owed. The phone on his desk rang, and his assistant's voice came through the speaker. Mr. Kramer, there's a woman here to see you. She says she has information about her husband's business practices that might interest you. Alexander smiled. The same cold expression that had been the last thing Troy and Natasha ever saw. Send her in, he said. I always have time for people who want to discuss betrayal. After all, justice was his business now. And business was very... And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.